nothing. FromSoftware is one of the biggest names in gaming today. Most people know him for Dark Souls, some know him for Armored Core, but then you start going back and looking at their old stuff. You find a lot of weird games that feel like early experiments from a studio still figuring out what it wanted to become. And Shadow Tower, I think, is one of the weirdest ones I've seen. I had played Eternal Ring as a kid, which was another one of FromSoftware's old first-person RPGs, but I never made it very far, and I honestly couldn't get into it back then. The combat has this specific feel to it. It's very heavily tied to timing and spacing, and it just didn't click with me at the time. But playing Shadow Tower now, it gave me a much stronger appreciation for the style of game. I started seeing how much of FromSoftware's later identity was already sitting inside here. This is a game with really vague exploration, these weird NPCs, equipment that doesn't last more than an hour, and even progression tied to Souls way before Dark Souls made that system famous. So what was FromSoftware trying to do here? How did this thing actually play? And why does this game feel like one of the roughest early ideas of where the studio would eventually go? What was Shadow Tower? Before we get into the actual tower, we gotta look at the game it will always be compared to, Kingsfield. Kingsfield was FromSoftware's first console game, and for a first step into the industry, it was a pretty weird one. They came out of business software, moved onto the PlayStation 1, and instead of making something bright and easily approachable, they made a slow, first-person fantasy RPG about being dropped into a deadly world and essentially just being told to figure it out. I feel like that choice really shaped the early version of the studio, and honestly, you can still feel that mindset in a lot of what came after. Kingsfield gave them a style they could build on, and it gave them a way to make RPGs that just kind of felt lonely and deadly, and just packed with lore without needing constant cutscenes or very much explanation. You learned by moving through the world, getting lost, finding equipment, talking to whoever you find alive, and just slowly understanding how the world worked. So when FromSoftware kept going with Kingsfield, they were refining those ideas. By the time Shadow Tower entered the picture, FromSoftware had already made a handful of these games. They knew the pace, the audience it was meant for, and how to build this kind of dark first-person world, and I think that's what makes Shadow Tower kind of interesting. It came from those ideas, but FromSoft didn't seem to look at it as just another Kingsfield.
King Gills went ahead here.
There was an interview from 1998 where they talked about wanting Shadow Tower to become the first scenario in a new series. So even though it's very similar, they wanted it to become its own thing. I think you can feel that all over the game. Shadow Tower is close enough to Kingsfield that the comparison's impossible to avoid, but it also feels like they wanted to push the formula into a rougher place. The fantasy feels less inviting, the world just feels a bit more broken, and the whole thing has more of a survival edge than a traditional dungeon crawler. And the timing of that lines up with what they were doing around the late PlayStation era. They were branching out really fast. Armored Core had already opened a new direction for them in '97. That game gave the studio a completely different identity, built around mechs and customization. Then Echo Knight came out in '98 and pushed their first-person structure towards ghosts and a more atmosphere-heavy experience. So Shadow Tower lands in this stretch where FromSoftware was clearly not tied to one specific type of game. This was them taking a familiar first-person RPG structure and giving it a separate name, a much darker tone, and a set of hardcore expectations. Before Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, before this kind of design became something people actively looked for, Shadow Tower was already testing how much the player would put up with if the world kept pulling them deeper. And that starts with the tower itself. The game gives you a very simple direction. Go deeper. Let's start this bit off talking about the controls. The game comes from an era where first-person console games had a very different control scheme. This was before dual analog sticks became the default layout for movement. How we move in first-person today didn't become the default until 2000 with Alien Resurrection. So, movement in this is completely spread across the D-pad and shoulder buttons. Up and down move you forward and backwards, left and right turns. The shoulder buttons strafe and the triggers look up and down. If it's been a while since you worked with those controls, it takes quite a bit to get used to. Moving through a room, checking a corner, or just looking up and down takes a lot more thought than it would in a modern first-person game, but that was just part of the control style for a lot of games in that era. Once you get the hang of the controls, the basic structure of the game is pretty simple. You just keep descending the tower. That's pretty much the whole direction, entering different regions on each floor, searching through those areas, and eventually finding some way to keep moving downward. That's the surface level description here. The actual experience is a bit more complicated than that sounds. A lot of this game is wandering through maze-like areas until you stumble onto something. You're moving through caves, ruins, tunnels, these big open lost-in-the-void type areas looking for anything that might help. Progress in this comes from anywhere and everywhere. A special weapon or piece of gear tucked in a corner, a random enemy dropping something useful like a key, a hallway that loops back around and finally gives the area some kind of shape, a secret door that turns what you thought was a dead end into a path forward, or finally finding a boss tucked away somewhere. Then you go down a set of stairs and do it again. That's pretty much the whole rhythm of the tower. The game rarely feels like it's leading you from one point to the next. Most of the time, it feels like you're wandering around inside these deadly areas trying to figure out what the tower is willing to give you. That adds a lot to the lonely feeling.
No, it cannot be.
There is no real comfort in the layout. There's no strong sense that a route has been prepared for you. You can spend a long stretch moving through an area with no real certainty that you're even going the right way. And that uncertainty becomes part of the experience. You start checking every wall, remembering the different patterns for the enemies. You pay attention to the rooms that looked meaningless the first time through. And you treat every piece of gear like it might be the thing that gets you through the next few rooms. The sound adds another layer to that, or the lack of sound. This game doesn't have a soundtrack. There's no constant music when you're exploring or fighting. A lot of the time, the tower's carried by footsteps, weapons clashing, enemies screeching, and this hollow reverb that hangs over everything. Just about everything has this echo to it. And I think that gives the tower this closed-in feeling. The areas can open up, and some of them are bigger than you'd expect. But the sound still makes everything feel sealed off. It really gives you the feeling of being alone and very deep below the surface. That atmosphere carries into the way the regions are built. The game has different worlds attached to the descent. There are areas tied to fire, water, earth, illusion, death, and some just weirder ones. Some themes come through stronger than others, especially as the game gets deeper. While the themes change, the actual exploration still mostly runs through caves and ruins in these old stone-looking areas. So the names give the tower a larger structure, and the rooms themselves keep you grounded in this rough maze-like journey. That can make the navigation pretty tricky. The rooms start to blur together, paths bend back on themselves. Some areas look similar enough that it becomes easy to lose your sense of where you came from. After a while, you start relying on whatever the game gives you, a certain object in the room, the shape of the room itself, these little landmarks that can help you remember where in this specific world you are. But even then, it can get pretty confusing. And the deeper you go, the weirder it gets. Early on, a lot of Shadow Tower still feels like your usual dark fantasy world. There are weird creatures from the start, but the world still has a rough fantasy shape to it. Later, that starts to loosen a bit. Some areas just feel like pieces of something else attached to the tower. You start moving through areas that almost feel like they're floating in the void. So by the end, it feels like you're almost in a different universe entirely. Even bosses fit that structure. They usually don't feel like big marked endpoints to the level. They feel like something discovered through the same process as everything else. Just wandering around long enough until you stumble onto one of them. They usually give you some dialogue before and after the fight, then you just wander deeper. That's pretty much how Shadow Tower handles progression through the world. You just wander through it.
It is still a far way to the crown, but it is good to struggle.
Hey, just real quick, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for hanging out with me for a bit. If you're enjoying it, consider subbing. There's a lot of content like this on the channel already, and there's always more coming. If you want to help the video grow and support it, drop a like and leave me a comment. Let me know if you've ever heard of this game before, or if you've played it, if you were a fan of Kingsfield, or just what your favorite FromSoftware game is. But alright, that's enough of all that. Let's get back into Shadow Tower and look at the leveling system, because it has some really interesting ideas. The leveling system in the game is one of those things I appreciated a lot more after looking into how it actually works. While I was playing, I could feel myself getting stronger over time. I could feel my health going up and my damage changing, and the character just slowly becoming more capable inside the tower. Which is normal, it's an RPG, you're going to get stronger. But I didn't fully understand how specific the game was being with that growth. Shadow Tower doesn't handle leveling like a normal RPG, where every enemy feeds one big experience bar. There's no simple, kill enough things, gain a level, pick a stat system in the game. The game handles growth in a weirder way. The different enemies can affect different parts of your character, so when you fight your way through the tower, the game's paying attention to what kind of enemies you're dealing with. Enemies are tied to certain stat increases, and that means the creature you fight can shape your character in different ways. And I really thought that was a cool idea. Because if you think about it in a practical way, fighting a three-headed dog would teach you something different than fighting a slime crawling on the floor. A heavy enemy teaches something different than a fast one. A flying enemy teaches something different than a swimming one. So the game's turning combat experience into actual experience, and that's the part that I thought was really interesting. Your character grows through contact with the tower. Every enemy has another piece of that. Every fight becomes part of what the character survived and learned from. And I do think that encourages you to fight more of what the tower puts in front of you. A new player probably would not understand that right away though. I definitely didn't fully understand it while I was playing. At first, it just feels like fighting enemies as part of surviving the area. Then after a while, you start feeling when your character's behind. Your damage feels a bit low, or your health pool is too small. Enemies just take longer to kill. That's where the growth system starts to show itself through pressure. The game doesn't explain any of what's happening. It just lets you feel weak, and that pushes you back into the tower to search more and fight more, uncover more of each area. That also keeps Shadow Tower from feeling like a game built around grinding. To me, it feels more like a game that rewards thorough exploration. If you only move through the main route and ignore the extra areas, you're going to miss a lot. A lot of enemies, gear, items, and chances for your character to grow. When you start pushing into the extended parts of each region, there's usually a lot more there than it first looks like. More rooms, creatures, paths. So combat and exploration start feeding into each other. You explore because you need gear, items, and a way forward. While doing that, you run into more enemies. Those enemies become part of your growth, and that growth helps you survive long enough to explore deeper. That loop is a big part of why the tower works for me. The enemy count adds to that too. Shadow Tower has a lot of creature variety. There's around 150. And once you understand the leveling system, that number feels even more interesting. Then on top of that, the game also has soul pods. These are items you find while exploring, and they give you soul power. That soul power can be placed into stats manually. So the enemy system shapes the character through what you fight, and the soul pods give you a more direct way to guide that build. For most of my playthrough, I put those points into strength, which build your health pool and speed. Those were what felt like priority to me early on. Then later on, once my health was around 5,000, I started putting more points into specific damage types like slashing or smashing. That's what I like about the soul pod side of the system. It gives you a little bit of control inside a game that usually doesn't give you much comfort. You still have to find the pods, you still have to survive long enough to use them. The tower still controls when those opportunities appear, but when you do find one, it feels like a chance to respond to what the game's been doing to you. I think the leveling in Shadow Tower works because it feels tied to what the character has actually survived. I want to get into durability because that's a pretty major system in the game, but first I think we need to talk about the actual combat rhythm, because Shadow Tower is slow. Every swing has to be timed with some intention behind it. The game uses this attack gauge, and every time you swing, the gauge drops. How full that gauge is affects how much damage you do. So if you just keep swinging as fast as possible, you're usually hurting your own damage output. So the combat flow starts to develop this rhythm. You move in, swing, back away, let the gauge refill, then look for the next opening. That sounds pretty simple, and I mean it is, but once enemies start closing distance or hitting harder, or there's just a bunch of them, that rhythm becomes the whole fight. You have to pay attention to where your character is, where the enemy is, and when the hit's actually going to land. With lighter weapons, that timing can feel a bit easier to manage. With heavier weapons though, the swing takes longer, so sometimes you want to start the attack before you're fully in range. That way, by the time you step into the enemy, the weapon's already coming down. It keeps you from standing right in front of something dangerous, waiting for the animation to finish. That's the kind of combat the game's built around. It's slow, deliberate, and honestly a bit awkward at first. But once you start getting used to it, there's a pace to it. You're reading distance, waiting for the gauge, stepping in, committing to the hit, and then backing out before the enemy punishes you. And every time you do that, your equipment's wearing down. That's where Shadow Tower starts getting mean. Every piece of gear has durability. Weapons wear down from being used, and armor wears down from taking hits. The things that keep you alive are constantly being spent just by playing the game. And that's not a crazy uncommon mechanic, but the way it works in this game is pretty hardcore. Early on, a lot of your equipment has low durability, so things break constantly. Later, you start finding stronger gear, and that helps, but keeping everything repaired is still a constant problem. Better equipment gives you more options, and the tower starts chewing through those options too. So you can never think of your loadout as something permanent. You might go into an area with the weapon and armor you want to use, and then a quarter way through, something breaks. A sword wears out, your helmet breaks. Then you're in the menu swapping to whatever's still usable. Sometimes that happens between fights, sometimes it happens while you're still in the middle of fights. Sometimes it happens 4 or 5 times in one encounter. It gives the equipment a very different feeling. Gear is valuable, but it's also very temporary. You're carrying tools that can fail, and the longer you stay in the tower, the more you start planning around that failure. In most cases, you can't ask yourself, what's my best weapon? You have to start looking at it as, what can I afford to wear down right now? That changes the way combat feels. Every fight has a cost attached to it. Even if you win without losing much health, you still spent weapon durability. If you got hit, your armor paid for it. So a fight can go well and still leave you worse off for the next one. That's where the survival side of the game really comes through. There's this slow drain of just everything you have. Your health, weapons, armor, your healing, your repair access, all of it starts feeding into the same pressure. The tower wears you down in layers, and the game builds its shop system around that. As you explore, you find these stones with different emblems on them. Some are used for saving, some move you to different parts of the world, some send you to shops. Over time, you start learning what those emblems mean.
Huh? What would a human want here?
The shop stones become a big deal because they give you access to health potions, magic potions, and repairs. The tricky part is those shops all share the same symbol. So when you find one, there's always this little moment of hope. You see the emblem and think, please be a repair shop. And then you step in and it's health potions, or magic potions. And sometimes that's useful, but when your gear's falling apart, and it usually is, all you really want is the repair shop.
What's a human doing here?
The repair shop is where the whole system comes together. Because in this game, repairing equipment costs health. You're using your own health pool to fix the gear that keeps you alive. And with how fast things wear down, this is something you have to deal with constantly. It's part of the regular rhythm of the game. You go deeper, your weapons and armor break down, you find repair access, then you have to decide how much of yourself you're willing to spend to put everything back together. The game does give that system a strange kind of balance though. Health potions restore your full health, so even if you have a huge health pool, like 7,000 points, one potion brings it all back. That changes how repairs work in practice, because health potions become tied directly to how much gear you can fix. The repair rhythm's kind of wild. You go into the shop, repair as much as possible, watch your health drop down to close to nothing, leave, use a health potion, go back in, and repair more. So really the health potions become healing, but also repair money. They're what let you keep your weapons and your armors alive. It's such a strange economy, because health is survival, but health is also a repair currency. The health potions are healing, but health potions are also the thing that lets you keep fixing everything that keeps breaking. So the game ties your body, your gear, and your progress together in a way that feels rough, but to me really memorable. There are also shops that use coons, which are a rarer currency. Those can give you access to stronger items, and they are useful when you find them. The coon shops add another layer to the economy, but the repair system is the part that really defines the experience for me. That's the system I kept thinking about while I was playing through it. Because once equipment starts breaking constantly and repair starts costing health, every decision gets a lot heavier. Do you keep using this weapon and risk breaking it, or swap to something weaker and save the better gear? Do you spend health now to repair everything? Do you use a potion so you can repair even more? Or do you just keep pushing deeper with damaged armor? Those are the questions the tower keeps throwing at you. And this is why the game can feel survival horror adjacent even when it's still an RPG. The horror is not only coming from creature designs or scary rooms, a lot of it comes from the way the systems squeeze you. Combat spends durability, damage spends armor, repair spends health. Healing keeps you alive and keeps your equipment alive. So the game turns survival into a budget. You're always spending something. And the further you go, the more careful you become about what you can afford to lose. So the story is pretty straightforward, at least the way it's presented. We play as Ruus, a mercenary who returns to the Holy Land of Zepter. When he gets there, the place is basically gone. Zepter, along with the tower at its center, has been pulled down into a massive hole. Ruus is looking for the old woman who raised him, and the people of Zepter have had their souls taken by the things below the tower. So the whole reason we're going down there is tied to rescue. The game gives us that motivation early and then sends us down. There's also the one-eyed crown. This crown's tied to the pit below the tower, and is treated as the thing that has the power to restore the souls that were taken. So Ruus is going down through the tower to defeat the Dark Ones, find the crown, and bring back the souls of Zepter. Before the descent really begins, Ruus receives the Dark One's sword. This weapon is treated as the thing that can actually injure the Dark Ones. So even though the story's light, the setup gives us enough to understand the direction. After that opening, the story becomes pretty sparse.
Yet not many around. No, but there are some of your kind below.
Shadow Tower doesn't constantly explain what's happening. It doesn't give long cutscenes after every region. Most of the game is just Ruus moving deeper, finding strange people, fighting through these different worlds, and slowly getting closer to whatever is waiting at the bottom. That gives the story a different kind of feeling. The plot is there, but it stays really thin. The tower does most of the work. The enemies, regions, just the weird NPCs, and the condition of the world tells us more about the situation than the game directly says. You can find people throughout the tower, and they add little pieces of texture to the descent. Some feel lost, others feel trapped, some feel like they've been down there for a long time. And because the game doesn't dress those conversations up with big cinematic moments, they feel more like things you find along the way. Just another part of searching through the tower and trying to understand what happened. The deeper Ruus goes, the more the rescue story gets swallowed by the place itself. At the start, the goal's easy to understand. Find the old woman who raised him, restore the souls of Zepter, and push towards the source of what happened. Then the game keeps sending you through weirder and more dangerous places, and the tower starts taking over the whole identity of the story. By that point, the question is still tied to saving Zepter. The experience starts feeling more like surviving the descent. That's where the game's plot works best. It gives us a reason to go down, then lets the tower become the thing that we're actually thinking about. Every region feels like another piece of Zepter's fall. Every strange enemy and broken area adds to the feeling that this place has been pulled into something much larger than one town disappearing. Eventually, Ruus reaches the end of that descent. By the final scene, he's completely drained. He's walking, barely holding on, and then he falls to his knees. He asks if it's over, then he starts searching for the crown. An entity appears and asks why he seeks it, and that the crown has the power to grant any wish. Then the crown appears in front of Ruus, and then the game cuts forward. We see Ruus standing as a ruler on a castle balcony, looking out over the mountains. The crown's beside him, and Ruus says the crown gave him the power to become a conqueror. That ending gives the story a sharper final edge. The crown begins as the thing that can restore the souls of Zepter. Then by the end, it becomes the thing that gives Ruus power. The game doesn't spend much time explaining the space between those moments, though. It shows Ruus at the bottom, exhausted and searching, then it shows the crown offering the power to grant a wish. Then it shows the result. So the story is simple, but it leaves the game with an uneasy final note. Ruus goes down into the tower trying to recover what was lost, but by the end, he becomes a conqueror.
It hurts. Help me.
By the time the game came out in North America in '99, it was landing very late in the PlayStation's life, and that timing is a big thing here. The PlayStation had already changed a ton by then. RPGs had gotten bigger and more cinematic. Action games were getting faster, and 3D games were becoming easier to move through, easier to understand, and just more comfortable for a wider audience. Then Shadow Tower comes up as this slow first-person dungeon RPG where the game gives you very little guidance. The controls take some adjustment, and the soundtrack is basically absent, and even repairing your gear hurts you. That was going to be a hard sell, especially at that moment. This was a game asking people to meet it on very harsh terms. It wanted patience, trial and error. It wanted players to spend time inside uncomfortable areas, get lost, break gear, run out of resources, and slowly learn how the tower worked. For some people, that kind of design can become the hook. For a lot of people in 1999, though, it was probably just exhausting. And the reviews kind of reflect that. The game landed extremely rough at the time. Famitsu gave it a 27 out of 40 in Japan. Its game rankings average ended up around 49%, and in North America, EGM went as low as 2 out of 10. So the game did struggle a lot critically, but I think it's easy to understand why. Shadow Tower is awkward. It's slow, it's confusing, it asks a lot from the player before it starts giving much back. Even after spending time with it, I'd never describe it as an easy game to recommend to everybody. The game has a very specific audience.
You will not go any further. I'll turn you to ash with my flame.
You have to be willing to sit with that older first-person movement. You have to accept that the game's going to let you wander with very little direction. You have to deal with weapons and armor breaking all the time, and be okay with a story that gives you the setup, sends you down, and then just leaves most of the weight to the tower itself. That's a lot to ask, especially during a time when games were moving towards smoother pacing and bigger presentations. So I don't think the rough reception is some big mystery here. The game came out in a market where its strengths were also the same things that made it difficult to embrace. The harshness, silence, slow combat, the vague progression, repair economy, all of that gives the game its identity now. At the time, those same qualities made it feel dated, clunky, and hard to approach. That's the strange thing about looking back at it now. The parts that probably pushed people away in '99 are the exact parts that make the game worth talking about now. When people go back through FromSoftware's old catalog, Shadow Tower stands out because it feels so committed to making the player endure the tower on its terms. It had no interest in smoothing itself out or making the descent comfortable. It was built around pressure, scarcity, confusion, and survival. Kind of design has a much larger audience now because FromSoftware spent years teaching people how to value those feelings in different forms. After Demon Souls and Dark Souls, more people became used to games that explain less, punish your mistakes harder, and ask you to learn through failure. Shadow Tower arrived before that audience was fully there, so its reception feels tied to timing as much as quality. So looking at Shadow Tower now, its place in the whole FromSoftware history I think is a lot easier to understand. It never became one of their major names, but it did continue. At least briefly, with Shadow Tower Abyss on the PS2. That's equal state in Japan though, so for a lot of people outside of Japan, Shadow Tower remained this obscure PS1 game sitting somewhere near Kingsfield in FromSoftware's old catalog. Years later, the game feels more interesting because we have so much more context for the studio now. After Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, it's easier to look back at Shadow Tower and recognize pieces of FromSoftware's identity forming this early. Just the overall structure of the world and how it works, the vague NPCs, the souls, the harsh resources, the way progress comes from learning the actual areas. Those ideas become a lot more familiar later. In Shadow Tower, they feel a bit rougher. But all of that is what gives Shadow Tower its own identity. And it's worth remembering because it shows FromSoftware taking the first-person RPG style they built with Kingsfield and pushing it into something more survival-driven and hardcore. And overall, I did enjoy it. This was the first old first-person RPG-like game I've played since I was a kid, and it made me really want to play others like it. They take some adjusting to get into, but once they click, it's a really unique experience. But overall, the game is rough, it's awkward, and it's punishing. And really, that's probably why it still stands out now. And that's Shadow Tower. It's rough and weird, but I really enjoyed it more than I expected. But if you enjoyed the video, consider subbing to the channel. There's a lot of content like this already on there, and there's always more coming. But also leave a like and drop a comment. Let me know if you ever played this game, or what you thought about it from watching this, or if you'd like to see it come back in some way. But again, thank you, and as always, I'll see y'all later.
No. No.